superstitions that guided every harvest, every birth, every meal. A time when to question tradition was to tempt misfortune, and when the smallest act of defiance could be seen as rebellion against the order of heaven itself. You'll smell the damp straw of the barn floor. You'll hear the tired murmur of prayers before dawn. You will feel the chill that creeps through the village once the curfew bell tolls and every door is barred against wolves and worse things that walk unseen. These are the forgotten laws of daily life, where faith was law, silence was safety, and routine was survival. The strange, unspoken commandments that held together a world always one poor harvest away from despair. So before you settle in, take a moment to breathe. Let the world slow down a little. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, you can subscribe, but only if you truly find peace here. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let S travel back to a morning when the first church bell called the peasants from their dreams into a day already ruled by rules. The laws of the land, the day begins with the bell. The darkness of the medieval night was a profound, often terrifying realm, broken only by the flickering glow of a dwindling hearth fire and the hushed whispers of anxious sleep. For the peasant, the true beginning of the day was not the sun's hesitant blush on the horizon, but a sound, a singular, metallic pronouncement that cut through the pre-dawn stillness, awakening the village with an insistent, unyielding command. The local church bell, a voice of both God and the Lord, would ring at dawn, summoning peasants to work, and, more subtly, warning them of their inescapable duties, a profound, unwritten law that shaped every waking hour. You would be roused from a shallow, fitful sleep, not gently, but abruptly. The bell's clang, deep and resonant, would pierce the thick walls of your mud-daubed hut, vibrating through the packed earth floor, through the very straw of your bed. It was a sound both familiar and unavoidable, a declaration that the brief respite of darkness was over and the relentless cycle of labor was about to resume. Your body, stiff and aching from the cold and the arduous toil of yesterday, would protest, but the bell's command was absolute. The air in the hut, thick with wood smoke and the sense of sleep, would still hold the chill of the departing night. Your breath, when exhaled, would plume invisible clouds, a stark reminder of the cold that permeated everything. But the bell's summons was stronger than any physical discomfort. To ignore it, to sleep past its insistent call, was to risk the wrath of the Lord's reeve, to face fines, or even the whip, for your time was not your own. It belonged to the land and to the master of the land. You would push yourself up from your straw mat, groaning softly, feeling every muscle protest. Your family too would stir, your husband, his face a shadowed mask of weariness, already reaching for his coarse tunic. Your children, small bundles wrapped in rags, their whimpers quickly hushed by the urgency of the moment. The silence of the hut, moments ago filled with the sounds of sleep, would be replaced by the quiet, hurried movements of a family preparing for another day of unremitting labor. The bell's ringing was not just a signal for work, it was also a warning. It demarcated the sacred time of prayer, marking the first canonical hour, prime. Even before heading to the fields, a short, hurried prayer would be whispered, a plea for strength, for protection, for a bountiful harvest, a brief spiritual duty woven into the fabric of the morning rush. It reminded you that your life, though bound by earthly lords, was also under the watchful eye of God. As you stepped out of your hut, the cold morning fog might still cling to the ground, swirling like spectral forms over the freshly ploughed fields. Other peasants, their forms hunched and indistinct in the muted light, would already be making their way towards the fields, a slow, determined procession. The local church bell, now ringing its second, shorter peal, would be a constant, resonant backdrop, its sound echoing across the awakening village, a unifying declaration of collective duty. The rules were clear, though rarely written for the peasant. The land had to be worked, the Lord's fields before your own. The tithes to the church had to be paid. Your time, your strength, your very output were not entirely yours. The bell was the daily, audible reminder of this intricate web of obligations, a constant pressure that governed every aspect of your existence. The sounds of the village would slowly awaken, the distant lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the sharp clang of iron in a blacksmith's shop, already at work. These were the sounds of a world moving to the rhythm of the bell, to the rhythm of duty, to the rhythm of a life dictated by external forces. The local church bell rings at dawn, summoning peasants to work and warning them of their duties. The day began with the bell, a profound daily ritual that defined the weird daily rules medieval peasants actually lived by. It was an unspoken code, a constant pervasive presence that shaped their lives from dawn to dusk, a haunting reminder that their existence was bound by laws of land, faith, and the unyielding demands of their feudal masters, with no escape from its incessant call. Work, worship, and the law of the Lord. The insistent clang of the dawn bell had already faded, leaving behind a subtle echo in the cold morning air. For the medieval peasant, this sound was not just a signal to rise, it was a profound declaration of their inescapable reality. Their entire existence was bound by a rigid, immutable hierarchy, at the apex of which stood their feudal master. The law of the Lord was absolute. From sunup to sundown, their work was his, their produce owed to him, and even their worship, deeply intertwined with the church, implicitly served the established order. This was the unspoken code that dictated every aspect of their strenuous, often desperate lives. You would be in the fields before the morning fog had fully lifted, your back already aching from the cold and the long, hard day ahead. Your rough wooden plough, pulled by a straining ox, would cut through the damp earth, turning over furrows that stretched endlessly across the vast, open landscape. But these were not entirely your fields, nor was the labor solely for your family. A significant portion of your time, and the land itself, belonged to the Lord. Listen to the rhythmic creak of the plough, the lowing of the ox, the muffled shouts of fellow peasants working in the distance. Hear the sharp crack of an overseer's whip, a chilling reminder that your pace was constantly judged, your effort perpetually scrutinized. See the immense tracts of the Lord's domain, his own personal lands, which always had to be worked first, diligently, before you could even turn to your small, precarious strips of land that fed your own family. This was the essence of the corvée, the forced labor owed to your master. The law of the Lord was a complex tapestry of feudal obligations, customs, and strictures, rarely written down for the peasant, but deeply ingrained through generations of practice. It encompassed everything: the number of days you owed him labor, the portion of your harvest due as rent, the fees for using his mill, his oven, even his blacksmith. To defy these demands was to invite severe punishment: fines, confiscation of property, whipping, or even banishment from the land, a death sentence in all but name. Worship, too, was woven into this fabric of obligation. The church, though spiritually distinct, was often physically located on the Lord's land, its priest appointed by the Lord, its bells ringing at his command. While peasants found genuine solace in their faith, the weekly mass, the daily prayers, the seasonal festivals, all served to reinforce the existing social order. The priest preached obedience to earthly authority, emphasizing that the feudal hierarchy was divinely ordained, that your station in life was God's will. The air in the fields, thick with the smell of damp earth and hard labour, also carried the subtle tang of fear and resignation. Every act of toil, however small, was performed under the unseen yet pervasive gaze of the Lord. Your physical output was his to command, your time his to allocate. Even your social interactions were implicitly governed by his rules. Disputes referred to his court, marriages often requiring his approval. The church bell, which had summoned you to work, would also mark the hours of prayer, reminding you of both your spiritual and secular duties. These were the twin pillars of your existence, holding you firmly in your place within the feudal system. The Lord's word is law. From sunup to sundown, work is his, and worship is for him. Work, worship, and the law of the Lord were the inescapable realities that shaped the weird daily rules medieval peasants actually lived by. It was an unspoken code, a constant pervasive presence that dictated every aspect of their strenuous lives, a haunting reminder that their existence was bound by the unyielding demands of their feudal masters and the absolute power of the land. But the rule of silence. In the intimate, often overcrowded world of the medieval peasant village, where mud-daubed huts offered little true privacy, noise was an ever-present element of daily life. The clamour of the marketplace, the shouts in the fields, the chatter of children. These were the familiar sounds of a functioning community. But as twilight deepened and the long, dark hours of night pressed in, a different, more chilling custom often took hold: the rule of silence. In some villages, talking after a certain hour was not just discouraged, it was enforced, seen as a violation that could invite dangers from the outside, or worse, suspicion from within. A peculiar, unwritten law that amplified the pervasive fear of the night. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and the close presence of many bodies, now infused with an unsettling quiet. The sounds were no longer the gentle murmur of family conversations or the rhythmic clang of tools. They were the soft crackle of a dwindling fire, the gentle breathing of sleeping family members, and the profound, almost oppressive stillness that descended over the entire village. Hushed whispers in dark barns and homes replaced the day's open chatter. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the church bell tolled the Angelus, a signal for evening prayer, a subtle transformation began. Families would gather in their huts, the evening meal consumed in growing quietude. The fire, carefully banked, would cast long dancing shadows on the rough walls, making familiar objects seem both comforting and slightly eerie. The rule of silence was rooted in a complex blend of practicality, superstition, and social control. Practically, deep darkness was dangerous. Noise could attract unwanted attention from wild animals, wolves, bears, or jackals, whose hunger grew bolder with the night. It could also draw the attention of human predators, wandering bandits, desperate outlaws, or even hostile scouts from rival lords. To speak loudly to draw attention to one's hut was to invite peril. Supernaturally, the night was believed to be the time when malevolent spirits, mischievous fairies, and witches were most active. Noise, particularly uncontrolled human chatter, was thought to disturb them, or worse, to attract their unwelcome attention, making the village vulnerable to curses, illness, or misfortune. Silence, therefore, became a form of protection, a way to render oneself invisible to the unseen forces of the dark. Socially, the rule of silence was an act of communal discipline. It enforced order, ensured that all attention was directed towards vigilance and rest, and subtly reinforced the authority of the village elders or the Lord's reeve. To break the silence, to speak loudly after the designated hour, could be seen as a challenge to this communal order, an act of carelessness, or even worse, a suspicious transgression. You would lie on your straw bed, huddled close to your family, your senses acutely tuned to the profound quiet. Your own voice, if you needed to speak, would be reduced to a whisper, barely audible above the soft breathing of your children. The occasional cough, the rustle of a restless body, the distant lowing of an animal. These were the only sounds that broke the careful stillness. The fear of breaking the rule was palpable. A single wrong word could invite danger, bring misfortune, or, most terrifyingly, spark the suspicion of neighbors, turning communal fear inward. The penalty for violation, though often unwritten, could range from public shaming to fines, or even a more severe punishment if a misfortune was subsequently linked to the transgression. In some villages, silence is not just golden, it's enforced. Talking after a certain hour could be seen as a violation. The rule of silence was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant pervasive presence that shaped their nights, deepening their secret fears and reminding them that their existence was bound by unseen dangers and the fragile strictures of communal order, where sound itself could be a betrayal. Rituals of the harvest. For the medieval peasant, life was an unrelenting dance with the land, its rhythms dictating every aspect of their existence. The culmination of this tireless toil, the moment of profound consequence, was the harvest. This was not merely hard work, it was a sacred season, infused with ancient beliefs, desperate hopes, and a myriad of strict rituals. Harvest time was a period where breaking tradition could mean disaster, inviting divine wrath, blighting the next year's crops, and threatening the very survival of the community, shaping every cut, every sheaf, with an unwritten code. Imagine the air thick with the golden dust of ripe grain, the earthy scent of drying stubble, and the pervasive aroma of communal effort and nervous anticipation. The sounds were no longer the distant clang of the bell or the hushed whispers of night. They included the rhythmic swish of scythes through standing grain, the cheerful shouts of reapers, the laughter of children gathering fallen stalks, and the low murmur of ancient songs sung in time with the arduous work. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields, now giving way to vast stretches of golden harvest. The harvest was the most critical period of the year, determining whether a family, and indeed the entire village, would survive the coming winter. Its success depended on both relentless human labor and the capricious favor of God and the spirits of the land. Thus, every stage of the harvest was accompanied by deeply ingrained rituals designed to ensure bounty, express gratitude, and ward off malevolent forces. Listen to the rhythmic swish of the scythes, a symphony of concerted human effort, as men and women moved through the fields, cutting down the precious barley and wheat. Hear the songs of the reapers, ancient melodies passed down through generations, their verses invoking blessings for the crops, giving thanks to God and the local spirits for their bounty. See the children, their small hands busy, gathering the fallen stalks, ensuring not a single grain was wasted, learning the profound value of every ear. The rituals began even before the first cut. A blessing might be offered to the field, a small sacrifice made to ensure a good yield. The first sheaf of grain, or the corn dolly, might be ceremonially cut and brought back to the village, woven into a symbolic figure representing the spirit of the harvest, to be kept until the next spring, ensuring fertility. Breaking this tradition, failing to honor the spirit of the land, could invite profound misfortune. There were strict rules about who could harvest and when. The Lord's fields had to be harvested first, a primary obligation. Working on a Sunday, a holy day, was a grave sin, even if the skies threatened rain and the crops risked rotting. To rush the process to show disrespect for the land or its bounty could be seen as an act of hubris, inviting divine punishment, a failed crop next year, a pestilence on the livestock. The harvest festival, often held after the last sheaf was brought in, was itself a series of strict rituals and celebrations, thanking God for the bounty, feasting on the year's new bread and beer, but always with an underlying awareness of the fragility of their existence. The air in the fields, thick with the scent of cut grain and human sweat, also carried the subtle tang of fear and reverence. Every cut, every sheaf gathered, every song sung was performed with an acute awareness of the unwritten rules, the profound significance of their actions. Harvest time isn't just hard work, and it's a time of strict rituals where breaking tradition could mean disaster. The rituals of the harvest were a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their most critical season, deepening their secret fears and reminding them that their very survival was bound by tradition, by faith, and by the capricious will of the land and its unseen spirits. The Peasants' Curfew. As the sun, a tired eye, began its slow, inevitable descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky in bruised hues of purple and orange, a palpable shift occurred in the medieval village. The clamour of the day's work began to subside, replaced by a hurried, almost frantic energy. For the peasant, the setting sun was not merely a transition to evening, it was a profound, unyielding command. The peasant's curfew was absolute. When the sun sets, peasants must be inside, for the dark held a myriad of dangers, from the primal threat of wolves to the human menace of roving bandits enforcing a weird, pervasive rule that transformed their homes into fragile fortresses. Imagine the air, now cool and gentle, carrying the earthy scent of drying mud-daubed huts, the distant aroma of cooking fires, and the subtle perfume of reeds whispering in the river winds. The sounds were no longer the shouts of farmers, they included the hurried thud of doors being barred, the lowing of animals being coaxed into byres, and the anxious cries of children being pulled indoors. The hush of evening on the Euphrates gave way to the tense, collective drawing inward of a community bracing for the night. The curfew, often unwritten but universally understood, was a fundamental law of survival. As the light faded, a profound sense of urgency gripped every family. Tools vital for the next day's toil were brought indoors. Animals, precious sources of food and warmth, were secured in their enclosures, often within the very hut itself. Any stray child, any lingering adult, would be called in with sharp, insistent urgency. Listen to the hurried thud of heavy wooden doors being slotted into place, the metallic scrape of iron bars being drawn across the thresholds. Hear the anxious bleating of sheep as they were shooed into their byres, the agitated clucking of chickens settling into their coop. See the flickering firelight from countless small dwellings, tiny beacons against the encroaching darkness, slowly winking out as families retreated into their confined sanctuaries. The reasons for the curfew were manifold, rooted in both practical necessity and deep-seated fear. Practically, deep darkness was perilous. The uneven, muddy paths became treacherous, easily leading to injury. More importantly, the night was the domain of predators. Wolves, bears, and other wild beasts. Their hunger, sharpened by the lean seasons, grew bolder with the dark, stalking the edges of the village, preying on unattended livestock or unwary humans. Supernaturally, the night was believed to be the time when malevolent spirits, mischievous fairies, and witches were most active. To be caught outside after dark was to risk encounters with these unseen forces, inviting curses, illness, or profound misfortune. The eerie silence of the night, broken only by unsettling sounds, amplified these ancient fears. And then there were thieves and outlaws, desperate men driven by hunger or greed, who used the cover of darkness to prey on the vulnerable. roving bandits, renegade soldiers, or desperate vagrants, these human predators would strike swiftly, silently, their presence transforming the night into a realm of terrifying violence. To be outside was to be utterly exposed, to invite robbery, injury, or death. You would sit by your hearth, the fire now banked and low, listening to the silence outside. Your own voice, if you needed to speak, would be reduced to a whisper. Your husband beside you would remain vigilant, his hand resting on the heavy cudgel or axe, kept close by the straw bed, his ears acutely tuned to any sound from beyond the barred door. When the sun sets, peasants must be inside. The dark holds dangers, from wolves to roving bandits. The peasants' curfew was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their nights, deepening their secret fears, and transforming their homes into fragile fortresses against the manifold terrors of the outside world, a fundamental law of the land, superstitions and supernatural rules, the rule of the witch's mark. In the medieval peasants' world, where life was a constant struggle against inexplicable misfortunes, famine, illness, sudden death, the human mind often sought tangible explanations for the unseen. This desperate search fueled a pervasive, terrifying belief in malevolent forces, chief among them witchcraft. The rule of the witch's mark was a chilling, unspoken code. A blemish on the skin might not just be a mark, it could be a sign of witchcraft, a demonic pact, and the fear it instilled ruled the peasants' every move, turning suspicion inward and poisoning communal trust. Imagine the air thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts, mingled with the pervasive aroma of wood smoke and the subtle tang of fear. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of neighbors. They included hushed whispers behind cupped hands, nervous murmurs in dark barns, and the distant, mournful toll of a church bell, its sound infused with the dread of unseen evil. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might obscure not just the landscape, but the dark intentions of a suspected witch. The belief in witches was deeply ingrained in medieval society, from the highest noble to the lowest peasant. Witches were believed to be individuals, often women, who had made a pact with the devil, gaining supernatural powers to inflict harm. They could blight crops, sicken livestock, cause illness, stir discord, or even bring death through curses, charms, or the dreaded evil eye. Listen to the low, furtive whispers in the marketplace as neighbors exchanged fearful glances, discussing a recent misfortune. A cow that suddenly stopped giving milk, a child's inexplicable illness, a husband's sudden strange behavior. Could it be old Agnes? Someone might murmur, their voice barely audible. She has a strange mark on her shoulder, like a birthmark, but unlike any I've seen. The witch's mark was a terrifying concept. It was believed to be a physical sign of a pact with the devil, a place on the body where the devil had touched or sucked blood, rendering the area insensible to pain. Such marks could be anything: a mole, a birthmark, a scar, an unusual skin blemish. But in an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, any unusual imperfection on the skin, particularly of someone already unpopular or eccentric, could become damning evidence. The fear it instilled ruled the peasants' every move. You would eye your neighbors with a subtle apprehension, searching for any unusual physical characteristic, any strange behavior that might confirm your deepest suspicions. To accuse someone of witchcraft was a grave act, but to ignore the signs was to invite profound misfortune upon your own family. The consequences of being identified with a witch's mark were devastating, often leading to ostracism, accusation, trial, often by ordeal, and ultimately a brutal death by burning or hanging. The very word witch could drain the color from a face, bringing an immediate, terrifying silence to any gathering. Children, too, absorbed this fear implicitly. They learned to be wary of those whispered about, to avoid their gaze, to understand that the world was full of unseen dangers and that some people carried evil within their very bodies. The air, thick with the smell of earth and sweat, also carried the subtle, unsettling tang of pervasive fear. Every unusual event, every inexplicable misfortune was quickly linked to a potential witch, her mark a terrifying confirmation of her malevolent power. A blemish on the skin might not just be a mark, it could be a sign of witchcraft. The rule of the witch's mark was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their interactions, deepening their secret fears, and reminding them that their very existence was bound by the terrifying power of the supernatural, capable of poisoning communal trust and bringing swift, brutal injustice. The cursed harvest. For the medieval peasant, life was a continuous, precarious dance with the land, its bounty dictating their very survival. After months of relentless toil, ploughing, sowing, irrigating, weeding, the moment of harvest was the culmination of all hope, all prayer. Thus, one of the deepest, most pervasive fears was the cursed harvest. If the harvest failed, it wasn't just bad luck or poor weather. It could mean divine punishment, a profound sign of God's anger, or the malevolent work of spirits, threatening to plunge an entire community into famine and despair. Imagine the air, thick with the dusty, acrid scent of withered crops, mingled with the pervasive aroma of fear and profound disappointment. The sounds were no longer the rhythmic swish of scythes or the cheerful shouts of reapers. They included the mournful lowing of starving cattle, the desperate cries of hungry children, and the chilling whisper of wind through empty, blighted fields. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields now revealed a devastating tableau of withered, stunted plants. The first signs would emerge subtly, a persistent blight that defied explanation, turning green shoots black, an infestation of unseen insects that devoured the precious grain, a sudden, unseasonal frost that blackened delicate young plants overnight, or, most terrifyingly, a drought that refused to break, leaving the earth cracked and the crops withered on the stalk. Each anomaly was observed with a tightening gut, a growing sense of foreboding, a desperate search for meaning in the unfolding disaster. Listen to the mournful lamentations sung in the churches as the priests and people struggled to comprehend the mounting misfortunes. Hear the desperate prayers of farmers, their voices lifted to the heavens, begging for rain, for an end to the blight, for God's mercy. The belief in a cursed harvest was deeply ingrained. It was not merely a matter of poor agricultural practice, it was a profound spiritual crisis. The harvest was a gift from God, a blessing for the pious. A failure, therefore, implied divine displeasure, a punishment for the sins of the community, for unconfessed transgressions, for a lapse in faith. The priest in his sermons would often reinforce this belief, calling for penance, for renewed devotion to appease a wrathful God. But the curse could also come from more earthly, yet still supernatural, sources. A witch, angered by a slight, could blight the crops. A malevolent forest spirit, disturbed by human encroachment, could send unseen pests. The evil eye of an envious neighbor could wither the bounty. These were not just superstitions, they were very real threats, actively shaping the fears and suspicions within the village. The work, usually performed with grim determination, now felt futile, infused with a deep sense of wasted effort. You would still tend the fields, of course, pulling weeds, scaring away birds, but each movement was heavy, each effort a desperate gamble against overwhelming unseen forces. The communal fear was palpable. The emptiness of the granary, a grim certainty, would bring the spectre of famine to the forefront. The suffering of children, the increasing weakness of the sick and elderly, the growing desperation within the village, all were seen as direct consequences of the cursed harvest. If the harvest failed, it wasn't just bad luck. It could mean divine punishment. The cursed harvest was a weird, pervasive and often terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their most critical season, deepening their secret fears and reminding them that their very survival was bound by the capricious will of God, the malevolent power of spirits, and the profound, unforgiving nature of a world where breaking tradition could mean disaster, bringing utter despair. Unholy days. In the profoundly religious and superstitious world of medieval peasants, the passage of time was not merely a secular rhythm of days and nights, but a sacred tapestry woven with divine grace and perilous omens. Certain days of the year were deemed unholy, cursed, or simply unlucky, marked by strict prohibitions: no work, no travel, and no celebrations. To transgress these unspoken rules was to invite misfortune, illness, or even death, a pervasive, eerie fear that shaped their calendars and dictated their very movements, a strange adherence to invisible cosmic forces. Imagine the air, thick with the usual earthy smell of mud-daubed huts, but infused with an unsettling stillness, a palpable tension. The sounds were no longer the cheerful clamour of daily toil. They included the low murmur of whispered warnings, the rustle of woolen cloaks as families remained indoors, and the profound, almost unnatural silence of fields left untended. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might conceal the lurking dangers of an unholy day, best avoided at all costs. These unholy days, often called dies mali, evil days, or Egyptian days, were scattered throughout the year, their origins rooted in a mix of ancient pagan beliefs, astrological calculations, and later folk interpretations of Christian calendar events. Each month typically had one or two such days carefully noted in rudimentary calendars or passed down through oral tradition by village elders and local wise women. Listen to the hushed whispers of your neighbors warning against particular dates. The first Monday after the new moon is ill-omened for travel, an elder might advise, his voice low and serious. Plant no seeds on the third Tuesday of the year, lest they wither in the earth. See the fields, usually bustling with activity, now standing eerily empty, a testament to the pervasive fear of these cursed times. To engage in work on an unholy day was to invite profound misfortune. The seeds sown might fail to sprout or bear blighted fruit. The bread baked might fall flat or spoil quickly. The cloth woven might tear easily or attract vermin. Any task undertaken was believed to be cursed, destined to bring ill luck, or to actively undermine the efforts of the diligent peasant. Travel on such days was particularly perilous. The roads were believed to be haunted by malevolent spirits, by mischievous fairies, or by the spirits of the unquiet dead. Accidents were more likely, encounters with bandits more frequent, and the risk of succumbing to sudden illness greatly magnified. Even joyous celebrations like weddings or feasts were strictly avoided, for their happiness was believed to be tainted, destined to end in sorrow. The fear was not just of the immediate practical consequences, but of the deeper spiritual implications. To violate an unholy day was to challenge the cosmic order, to disrespect the powerful unseen forces that governed their world. It could invite the wrath of saints or the malevolence of pagan spirits, bringing a curse upon the individual or even the entire family. You would spend these days quietly indoors, perhaps attending extra prayers in the church, or performing small protective rituals within your hut. Children would be kept close, admonished to be quiet, to avoid any activity that might draw unwelcome attention from the unseen dangers. Certain days of the year were deemed unlucky, marked by no work, no travel, and no celebrations. Unholy days were a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their calendars, dictating their movements, deepening their secret fears, and reminding them that their very existence was bound by invisible cosmic forces, demanding adherence to their strange, unwritten rules. The ghost rule. In the medieval peasants' world, the veil between the living and the dead was thin, permeable, and profoundly influenced daily existence. Death was a constant companion, but it was rarely a finality. Spirits of the dead weren't just stories told by the hearth, they were active participants in everyday life, guiding or haunting. The living their presence a pervasive, eerie reality that shaped rituals, instilled fear, and dictated a host of unspoken rules, a chilling testament to their enduring power. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts and the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, now infused with the subtle tang of unspoken fear and reverence. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of neighbors. They included hushed whispers of warnings, the rustle of woolen cloaks as people avoided certain paths, and the profound, almost unnatural silence near a new grave. The sharp clang of iron in a blacksmith's shop was a comfort, its metal believed to ward off restless spirits. The belief in ghosts, or the spirits of the departed, was deeply ingrained in medieval peasant culture. Not all spirits were malevolent. Ancestor spirits were often believed to be benevolent, watching over their living kin, offering protection and guidance, particularly during difficult times. Offerings might be left for them at the hearth, or graves carefully tended to ensure their continued favor. Listen to the low, furtive whispers around the fire, recounting tales of a grandmother's spirit seen hovering near the loom, or a deceased father's voice heard in the wind, offering a warning. Hear the solemn pronouncements of the priest, affirming the existence of souls in purgatory, in heaven, or tragically in hell, reminding the living of their spiritual duties to the dead. See the crude wooden crosses in the village churchyard, often adorned with ribbons or small offerings, marking the graves believed to be visited by their departed occupants. But the fear of restless, malevolent spirits was equally potent. Those who died violently, or without proper burial, or with unconfessed sins, were believed to be trapped between worlds, unable to find peace. These unquiet dead could return to haunt the living, causing illness, bad luck, or even driving people to madness. Night was their domain, their power believed to wax strongest in the profound gloom. The ghost rule dictated a host of behaviors. Certain paths, particularly those near the churchyard or ancient burial mounds, might be avoided after dusk lest one encounter a wandering spirit. New graves were sometimes guarded for a few nights to ensure the spirit rested peacefully or to prevent malevolent forces from disturbing the deceased. Objects belonging to the dead might be treated with caution, sometimes buried with them, or ritually purified, lest they carry the lingering presence of the unquiet. Blessings and prayers were offered, not just for the living, but for the dead, seeking to speed their journey to paradise, to bring peace to their souls, and to prevent their return to the earthly realm. Charms and amulets, consecrated by the priest or imbued with folk magic, were worn to ward off malevolent spiritual influence. The air, thick with the smell of earth and sweat, also carried the subtle, unsettling tang of pervasive fear and reverence. Every unexplained sound, Every sudden chill, every strange occurrence could be attributed to the presence of a spirit, demanding careful interpretation and appropriate ritual. Spirits of the dead aren't just stories. They are active participants in everyday life, guiding or haunting the living. The ghost rule was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their rituals, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by the thin veil between life and death, and the enduring, often terrifying, power of the unseen spiritual world. Blessings before eating. For the medieval peasant, food was not merely sustenance, it was a sacred gift, painstakingly wrested from an often unforgiving land, a precious commodity that meant the difference between life and death. In a world permeated by deep faith and pervasive superstition, the act of eating was therefore imbued with profound spiritual significance. Blessings before eating were not just polite custom. Every bite had to come with a prayer for breaking. This rule was believed to lead to illness, misfortune, or even divine wrath, transforming a simple meal into a vital daily ritual of reverence and fear. Imagine the air thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts, the comforting aroma of cooking pottage, and the subtle tang of wood smoke. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of neighbors. They included hushed murmurs of gratitude, the soft rustle of woolen cloaks as families gathered, and the profound, reverent silence before a meal. The sharp clang of iron in a blacksmith's shop might have faded, replaced by the intimate sounds of a family huddling by the hearth. As the family gathered around the hearth for their meager meal of coarse bread and thin pottage, the customary silence would fall. Before a single morsel was consumed, the head of the household, father, mother, or eldest elder, would lead the family in a solemn blessing. This was a moment of profound gratitude, an acknowledgement that all sustenance came from God, from the bounty of the land and from the relentless toil of their own hands. Listen to the low, murmured words of the blessing. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty, through Christ our Lord. Amen. Or a simpler, more personal prayer, thanking God for the harvest, for the health of their family, for the food they were about to consume. These words, whispered into the smoky air, were a sacred invocation, consecrating the meal. The belief in the sacredness of food was deeply ingrained. It was a gift, hard-won and precious, not to be taken lightly. To eat without giving thanks, to consume carelessly, was seen as an act of disrespect, of ingratitude, not just to God, but to the spirits of the land that had provided. Such an act could invite profound misfortune, blighting future harvests or even attracting malevolent forces. Breaking this rule was believed to lead to dire consequences. To consume a meal without blessing could lead to illness, for the food itself might be tainted by unseen evil or divine displeasure. It could bring bad luck, causing tools to break, animals to sicken, or crops to fail. In a world where cause and effect were often mysterious, such misfortunes were quickly linked to failures in ritual observance. For the children nestled close, this ritual was implicitly absorbed. They learned early the importance of the blessing, the sacredness of food, the necessity of gratitude. They understood that their very survival depended not just on hard work, but on maintaining the correct spiritual relationship with God and the forces of the natural world. The air, thick with the smell of earth and sweat, would also carry the subtle, reverent aroma of the blessed meal. Every bite, every sip of thin ale was imbued with a heightened significance, a daily act of communion and profound dependence. Food is sacred, and every bite must come with a prayer. Breaking this rule can lead to illness or misfortune. Blessings before eating were a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life, for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant pervasive presence that shaped their most intimate daily ritual, deepening their secret fears and reminding them that their very existence was bound by faith, by custom, and by the capricious will of God, transforming a simple meal into a vital act of reverence and survival. Daily work, daily rituals. The harvest festival code. For the medieval peasant, the rhythm of life was dictated by the land's arduous demands, culminating in the critical, exhaustive period of harvest. Yet even in their ceaseless toil, moments of communal celebration were vital, not just for joy, but for spiritual renewal and the preservation of social bonds. The harvest festival, usually held after the last sheaf was brought in, was not a spontaneous revelry. It was governed by a strict, intricate code. Even celebrations had rules. Specific days for feasts, certain foods for certain days, no exceptions. For breaking tradition could invite divine wrath, blighting the next year's crops and shattering the fragile promise of future bounty. Imagine the air, thick with the festive aroma of roasting meat, a rare treat, baking bread, and freshly brewed ale mingling with the earthy scent of the harvest. The sounds were no longer the rhythmic swish of scythes. They included the boisterous laughter of villagers, the lively strains of pipes and drums, the exuberant shouts of children, and the deep, communal singing of ancient songs. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might give way to vibrant, joyful gatherings, but always beneath the watchful eye of tradition. The harvest festival was the most important communal celebration of the year, a profound expression of gratitude for the bounty of the land and a desperate plea for continued favor. It typically lasted for several days after the arduous work of bringing in the crops was finally completed, but every aspect from its timing to its specific activities was dictated by a long-standing, often unwritten code. Listen to the lively strains of pipes and drums, their joyous melodies filling the village square, a welcome counterpoint to the usual sounds of toil. Hear the exuberant laughter of villagers, their voices raised in song and celebration, their faces flushed with ale, and the rare luxury of unburdened joy. See the communal feasting, long wooden tables laden with roasted fowl, thick stews, fresh barley bread, and copious amounts of beer, a stark contrast to their usual meagre fare. Specific days were set aside for the feasts, often coinciding with Christian holy days or older pagan festivals that had been absorbed into the Christian calendar. These dates were immutable, passed down through generations, their timing carefully observed. To begin the celebrations too early before the last sheaf was safely stored was to tempt fate, to risk offending the spirits of the harvest. To delay them too long was to show ingratitude. Certain foods were strictly designated for the festival. The first bread from the new grain, ceremonially baked, was often blessed before consumption. Roasted meat, a luxury almost never consumed by peasants, was a special offering, a symbol of abundance and celebration. Beer, brewed from the freshest barley, flowed freely, easing the weary bodies and spirits. Any deviation from these traditional foods, any attempt at inappropriate excess, could be seen as a challenge to custom, inviting misfortune. The rituals extended to the activities themselves. There would be traditional dances, often ancient folk rites, performed to ensure fertility for the coming year. Games of skill and strength would be played. Storytellers would recount ancient myths and heroic legends, binding the community in shared cultural memory. But even these joyous activities had their prescribed forms, their proper times. Breaking tradition, deviating from the harvest festival code, was believed to have dire consequences. It could anger the saints, displease the spirits of the land, or invite the malevolent interference of witches. The ultimate fear was a blighted crop in the following year, a return to famine, a direct consequence of disrespecting the sacred rules of celebration. Even celebrations have rules. Specific days for feasts, certain foods for certain days, no exceptions. The Harvest Festival Code was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their most joyous communal moments, deepening their secret fears and reminding them that their very survival was bound by tradition, by faith, and by the capricious will of God and the land, transforming a moment of celebration into a vital ritual of appeasement. The dress code of the peasant. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society where every aspect of life was strictly ordered, even clothing was imbued with profound social meaning. For the peasant, what you wore wasn't just about warmth, practicality, or personal choice. It was about who you were, a visual declaration of your status, your obligations, and your place within the feudal system. The dress code of the peasant was a complex web of unwritten rules, often enforced by custom and sometimes by law, and violating it could bring swift, brutal punishment, a constant, pervasive anxiety that governed every stitch and every thread. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed hut, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the subtle tang of human presence. The sounds were no longer the festive notes of pipes and drums. They included the hushed whispers of gossip, the rustle of coarse woolen cloaks in the wind, and the sharp crack of an overseer's whip, a chilling reminder of social boundaries. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might obscure faces, but never the clear lines of social standing. The peasant's wardrobe was, by necessity, simple, austere, and primarily functional. It consisted of rough tunics made from coarse wool or linen, often undyed or dyed in muted, earthy tones. Trousers or leggings, crudely cut, were worn by men while women wore long, simple dresses. A heavy cloak, woven from undyed wool, provided protection against the elements. Footwear was typically crude, leather boots or wooden clogs, stuffed with straw for warmth. Listen to the rustle of coarse wool as peasants moved through their daily tasks, the slap of their crude boots on muddy paths, the faint creak of leather. Hear the hushed whispers of gossip as a villager might comment on a neighbour's tunic. Is that new cloth? Did he not owe the Lord more? See the muted, earthy tones of their garments blending in with the landscape, a visual representation of their deep connection to the soil. But these seemingly simple clothes were governed by a strict, unspoken code, deeply rooted in sumptuary laws that, while primarily aimed at the nobility, permeated down to every level of society through custom and social expectation. Peasants were forbidden from wearing certain colours. Bright reds, purples, blues were reserved for the wealthy. Certain fabrics, silk, fine linen, or certain adornments, gold, silver, intricate embroidery. These distinctions were not just about expense, they were about maintaining the visible markers of social status. To wear clothes that were too fine for your station, to mimic the garments of a merchant, a knight, or, God forbid, a noble, was a profound transgression. It was an act of hubris, a challenge to the divinely ordained social order, and could invite swift, brutal punishment. The Lord's reeve or sheriff could impose fines, confiscate the offending garment, or even resort to whipping, a public humiliation designed to reinforce one's place. The fear of appearing out of place was pervasive. You checked your clothes carefully, ensuring they were patched and mended but never too new, never too ostentatious. Your garments were a constant, visible reminder of your humility, your servitude, your acceptance of your lot in life. For the children too, the dress code was implicitly absorbed. They learned early the visual cues of social hierarchy, understanding that their clothes, like their station, were fixed, immutable. What you wore wasn't just about warmth, It was about who you were and whether or not you were following the unwritten rules. The dress code of the peasant was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their very appearance, deepening their secret fears and reminding them that their existence was bound by strict social boundaries enforced by custom, law, and the ever-present threat of punishment, ensuring every peasant knew their place. The care of the livestock. In the medieval peasant's world, where life was a constant struggle for sustenance, livestock were not merely animals, they were living capital, extensions of the family, vital to survival. A cow provided milk and labour for the plough. Sheep offered wool for clothing and meat. Pigs provided essential protein. Thus, the care of the livestock was not a casual chore, but a deeply ritualized, often superstitious duty. There were strict rules about caring for animals, and breaking them could bring misfortune to your family, a profound, secret fear that entwined human fate with animal well-being. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of straw, dung, and the musky aroma of animals mingled with the pervasive wood smoke from the nearby hearth. The sounds were no longer the hushed whispers of gossip. They included the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the contented snuffling of pigs, and the anxious cries of sick animals. Hush whispers in dark barns and homes accompanied the rituals of animal care. Your family's small herd, perhaps a cow, a few sheep, a pig or two, and a handful of chickens, would be housed in a byre, often an extension of your own mud-daubed hut, or in a separate, crude barn. Their presence provided warmth in winter, but also demanded constant, meticulous attention. Listen to the low, contented murmurs of the cow as you milked her in the pale dawn light, her warm body a comforting presence against the cold. Hear the soft rustle of straw as you cleaned out the byre, carefully gathering the precious dung for fertilizer. See the animals, their coats dull but well fed, their eyes clear, a testament to your diligent care. The rules about caring for animals were numerous, passed down through generations, a blend of practical husbandry and deep-seated superstition. Animals had to be fed and watered daily, even when human bellies were empty. Their enclosures had to be kept clean, their bedding replenished. They had to be protected from predators, wolves, bears, and human thieves, a constant, vigilant watch. But beyond these practicalities, there were powerful, often strange, supernatural rules. Animals were believed to be susceptible to curses, to the evil eye, to the malevolent influence of witches and spirits. To protect them, specific rituals were performed. A sprig of rowan might be tied to a cow's horn, a charm placed above the byre door. Holy water, carefully acquired from the church, might be sprinkled on a new litter of piglets. A sick animal might be treated with not just herbal remedies, but with whispered incantations and specific faux prayers. Breaking these rules, whether practical or superstitious, was believed to have dire consequences. To neglect an animal, to mistreat it, to fail to perform the necessary rituals, these could invite profound misfortune. A cow might sicken and die, its milk turning sour. Sheep might succumb to disease, their wool failing. A piglet might be born deformed, or whole litter might vanish. Such misfortunes were quickly linked to failures in animal care, a direct manifestation of divine or spiritual displeasure. The fear was not just of the immediate economic loss, but of the wider implications for your family. A sick animal could lead to a failed harvest, to hunger in the winter, to the inability to pay taxes, pushing a family into utter ruin. The well-being of the livestock was inextricably linked to the well-being of the entire household. There were strict rules about caring for animals, and breaking them could bring misfortune to your family. The care of the livestock was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their daily rituals, deepening their secret fears, and reminding them that their very existence was bound by tradition, by faith, and by the health of the animals, a profound, terrifying connection between human and beast. The rule of the village elder. In the tightly knit, often isolated world of the medieval peasant village, where formal legal structures were distant and literacy rare order was often maintained not by written law, but by the weight of tradition and the wisdom of experience. At the heart of this communal governance stood the village elder, a figure of profound respect and authority. The village elder's wisdom was law, and their judgment was considered final, especially when disputes arose, a deeply ingrained, unspoken code that shaped interactions, resolved conflicts, and maintained the fragile social cohesion of the community. Imagine the air thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed hut, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the subtle tang of human presence. The sounds were no longer the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's shop. They included the low murmur of respectful conversation, the hushed whispers of arguments being presented, and the grave, measured tones of the elder delivering judgment. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might give way to solemn village gatherings under the watchful eye of tradition. The village elder, often the oldest and most respected man or woman in the community, had earned their position not through formal election, but through a lifetime of experience, accumulated wisdom, and demonstrated fairness. They were the living memory of the village, the custodians of its customs, its precedents, its unwritten laws. Their grey hair, their gnarled hands, their eyes, wise and knowing, commanded a profound, almost instinctive deference. Listen to the hushed tones of a peasant presenting a grievance, a stray animal, a disputed boundary line, a broken promise. Hear the low murmur of other villagers gathered to witness the proceedings, their faces grimly focused on the elder. See the elder, often seated on a simple stool by the hearth or in the communal meeting place, listening intently, his or her expression impassive, absorbing every detail, every nuance of the dispute. Their wisdom was law, not because it was formally legislated, but because it was rooted in the collective memory of the community, in generations of customary practice. Their judgment, drawn from this deep well of experience and an intimate understanding of the villagers' lives, was seen as both just and final. To defy an elder's ruling was to defy the very fabric of communal order, to invite social ostracism and profound disapproval. When disputes arose, a conflict over water rights for irrigation, a disagreement over shared labor, a question of inheritance, the elder would hear both sides patiently, carefully. They would weigh the evidence, consult precedent, and, crucially, consider the impact of their decision on the entire community. Their goal was not just retribution, but the restoration of harmony, the preservation of social cohesion. Their presence offered a vital sense of stability and justice in a world where formal legal systems were often distant, inaccessible, or biased towards the Lord. The elder was the local arbiter, the voice of reason, the embodiment of communal values. Their advice was sought on everything from agricultural practices to family matters, their counsel valued above all. The air, thick with the smell of earth and sweat, also carried the subtle, reverent aroma of profound respect. Every interaction with the elder was tinged with deference, every word spoken carefully considered. The village elder's wisdom was law, and their judgment was considered final, especially when disputes arose. The rule of the village elder was a weird, pervasive, and often comforting aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their daily interactions, deepened their sense of communal justice, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by tradition, by respect, and by the accumulated wisdom of their own, enduring community, maintaining a fragile social order. The ritual of the firstborn. In the medieval peasants' world, where life was a precarious dance with fate, and every birth a profound gamble against the high mortality rates, the arrival of a child was imbued with immense spiritual and social significance. Among these births, that of the firstborn held a particularly potent, often terrifying, weight. The ritual of the firstborn dictated that this child was thought to carry the blessings or curses of the family, their life following certain rules, that the younger siblings never had to follow an unspoken code that profoundly shaped their destiny from birth. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of a mud-daubed hut, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke and the subtle tang of fresh birth. The sounds were no longer the hushed whispers of arguments. They included the cries of a newborn, the low murmur of prayers, and the anxious pronouncements of the midwife. The morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might obscure the path, but never the profound significance of a new life entering the world. The firstborn, particularly a firstborn son, carried immense expectations and a heavy burden. They were the inheritors of the family's name, its land, if any, its debts, and its spiritual lineage. Their healthy arrival was celebrated as a profound blessing, a sign of divine favor, ensuring the continuity of the family line and its hard-won, precarious future. Listen to the anxious pronouncements of the midwife, her voice low and solemn as she delivered the newborn. Hear the heartfelt prayers of the parents, blessing their firstborn, invoking protection from saints and benevolent spirits. See the child, swaddled in rough linen, its tiny face red and wrinkled, its small life already weighed down by the immense, invisible mantle of its birthright. The firstborn child was believed to be a vessel for the family's spiritual inheritance. If the family had accumulated blessings through piety and good fortune, the firstborn would receive them, destined for prosperity and a long life. But if the family had incurred curses through sin, through ancestral transgressions, or through the malevolent actions of witches, the firstborn was believed to carry the brunt of this ill fortune, destined for sickness, hardship, or an early death. This belief dictated a host of specific rituals and rules for the firstborn that younger siblings did not necessarily follow. A firstborn son might be subjected to a more rigorous baptism, a special blessing from the priest, or a unique protective charm worn from birth. Their diet might be more carefully managed, their interactions more closely monitored, their education, however rudimentary, more diligently pursued, all in an effort to ensure their well-being and their successful navigation of their destined path. The psychological burden on the firstborn as they grew would be immense. They would be constantly aware of their unique status, their heavy responsibilities, and the profound expectations placed upon them. Their life was not entirely their own. It was inextricably linked to the fortunes of their family, to the blessings or curses they were believed to carry. The younger siblings, while valued, would live a life of comparatively less pressure, their destinies less profoundly tied to the weight of ancestral fate. They were free to follow a different path, to pursue different callings, their existence less burdened by the ritual of the firstborn. The firstborn child was thought to carry the blessings or curses of the family. Their life followed certain rules that the younger siblings never had to follow. The ritual of the firstborn was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped the earliest moments of life, deepening their secret fears and reminding them that their very existence was bound by custom, by fate, and by the powerful, often terrifying spiritual inheritance of their family. Rules of religion and the church. the rule of tithes. In the medieval peasants' world, where faith was as fundamental as food, the authority of the church was immense, shaping not only their spiritual lives but their daily economic realities. At the heart of this pervasive influence lay the rule of tithes, a sacred yet profoundly burdensome obligation. 1/10 of your produce and earnings laboriously wrested from the unforgiving land was owed to the church. Not giving enough was not merely a financial oversight. It could bring divine wrath, threatening eternal damnation, a pervasive, chilling fear that overshadowed every harvest and every meager earning. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of the threshing floor, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the subtle tang of fear and resignation. The sounds were no longer the rhythmic clang of tools. They included the solemn pronouncements of the priest, the anxious murmur of peasants, and the soft rustle of grain being measured out. Distant tolling bells, infused with the dread of divine judgment, underscored the immense power of the church. After months of relentless toil, ploughing, sowing, irrigating, weeding, and finally harvesting under the relentless sun, the moment of reckoning arrived. Your family's hard-won yield of barley or wheat would be brought to the communal threshing floor, where the grain was separated from the chaff, its quantity finally revealed. This was a moment of profound significance, a tangible representation of your year's work, your family's fragile security. Listen to the rhythmic scrape of measures as the grain was carefully, meticulously portioned. Hear the authoritative voice of the priest's representative, his words precise, his gaze unwavering, as he directed the measuring of the tithe. See the vast piles of grain, a golden promise of bread and beer, slowly being portioned out. And from it, a full 10th was separated, destined for the church's granary. This was the tithe, a sacred tax, an ancient obligation dating back to biblical times, enforced by both canon and secular law. It was intended to support the priest, maintain the church, and fund charitable works. But for the struggling peasant, already burdened by the Lord's taxes and the constant threat of hunger, it was a profound, often crushing, additional burden. Not giving enough, failing to render the full 10th, was not just a financial transgression. It was a grave sin, an act of sacrilege. It could incur divine wrath, leading to blighted crops, sick animals, illness in the family, or worse, eternal damnation for the unrepentant soul. The priest, in his sermons, would tirelessly reinforce this fear, reminding parishioners of the spiritual consequences of failing their obligations to God and His church. The fear was palpable, profound. You would watch, your heart heavy, your hands clenched, as your family's hard-won sustenance was slowly, systematically taken away. The sense of injustice, though perhaps deeply felt, was unspoken. This was simply the way of their world, the unyielding demand of a system that placed God and the church above the immediate needs of the individual. The remaining portion, already diminished by the Lord's taxes, was what was left for your own family. It was a meager allowance, requiring careful rationing, constant vigilance against vermin, and the terrifying prospect of hunger in the lean months. Your own family ate only after the church and the Lord had received their due. 1/10 of your produce and earnings go to the church. Not giving enough could bring divine wrath. The rule of tithes was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their economic realities, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by the unyielding demands of faith and the terrifying power of the church to both absolve and condemn in a world where God's judgment was as real as any earthly lord. The sacred days of rest. In the ceaseless, arduous grind of medieval peasant life, where every waking hour was often dedicated to relentless toil, the concept of rest was a rare and precious commodity. Yet for all their desperate need to work the land, certain days were deemed sacrosanct, inviolable. The sacred days of rest were absolute. Certain days of the week and the year were holy. No work, no exceptions, no matter how much you needed to survive, a profound unwritten law enforced by faith custom and the chilling fear of divine retribution. Imagine the air thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts and the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, now infused with a palpable stillness, an almost unnatural quiet. The sounds were no longer the rhythmic clang of tools or the murmur of peasants working in the fields. They included the solemn toll of the church bell, the low murmur of prayers, and the profound, almost eerie silence of fields left utterly untended. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields now remained undisturbed, awaiting the resumption of toil. The most fundamental sacred day of rest was Sunday, the Lord's Day. From sunset on Saturday to sunset on Sunday, all forms of strenuous labor were strictly forbidden. No ploughing, no sowing, no harvesting, no mending, no arduous travel. This was a day dedicated to God, to worship, to spiritual renewal, and to communal gathering. Listen to the solemn toll of the church bell, calling the entire village to Mass, its resonant sound echoing across the unusually silent fields. Hear the low murmur of prayers in the village church, the hymns sung in unison, the sermon delivered by the priest, reinforcing the sanctity of the day and the spiritual consequences of transgression. See the villagers, dressed in their cleanest, if still coarse, garments, gathered in collective devotion. Beyond Sundays, there were numerous other holy days throughout the year. Feast days of important saints, major Christian festivals like Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost. These too were days of enforced rest, days for pilgrimage, for special church services, for communal celebration, within strict religious confines. These days were often marked by a deeper sense of spiritual significance, a heightened awareness of God's presence in their lives. To violate these sacred days of rest, to engage in forbidden labor, was considered a grave sin, an act of defiance against God's will. The consequences were terrifying. It could bring divine wrath, leading to blighted crops, sick animals, illness in the family, or even a sudden, inexplicable death. The priest, in his sermons, would tirelessly reinforce this fear, reminding parishioners of the spiritual consequences of failing their obligations. The fear was palpable, profound. Even when a storm threatened to ruin a ripening harvest, even when hunger gnawed at empty bellies, a peasant would hesitate, often refusing to work on a sacred day. The risk of divine punishment, of incurring God's anger, was often seen as far greater than the immediate practical loss. Their very survival ultimately depended on God's favor. These days of enforced rest, however, also offered a precious, if structured, respite from the relentless grind of their lives. They were opportunities for spiritual reflection, for communal bonding, for the quiet strengthening of family ties. They provided a rhythm to their otherwise monotonous existence, a break in the ceaseless toil. Certain days of the week and the year were sacred. No work, no exceptions, no matter how much you needed to survive. The sacred days of rest were a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their calendars, dictated their movements, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by faith, by custom, and by the terrifying power of God, transforming the necessity of rest into a vital act of spiritual obedience. The rule of confession. In the profoundly Christian world of the medieval peasant, where eternal salvation or damnation were terrifyingly real prospects, spiritual purity was a constant, pressing concern. Life was short, brutal, and often fraught with sin, both intentional and accidental. The rule of confession was therefore a foundational pillar of their faith. To sin and not confess was to risk eternal damnation, and peasants lived in profound fear of the Church's power to absolve or condemn, a pervasive, chilling anxiety that shaped their moral compass and dictated their most intimate spiritual struggles. Imagine the air thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax candles, and the subtle tang of fear and penitence. The sounds were no longer the vibrant clamour of the day. They included the low murmur of whispered sins, the solemn voice of the priest, and the rustle of woolen cloaks as peasants waited anxiously for their turn. Distant tolling bells infused with the dread of divine judgment underscored the immense power of the Church to mediate their eternal fate. The sacrament of confession, often performed by the local parish priest in the dim light of the church, was a profoundly significant ritual. Peasants were expected to confess their sins regularly, typically at least once a year, often before Easter. This was a direct personal encounter with the spiritual authority of the Church, a moment of profound vulnerability and existential reckoning. Listen to the hushed whispers of a peasant kneeling before the priest, recounting their transgressions, petty theft, envy of a neighbour's better harvest, acts of lust, anger, or despair. Hear the solemn, measured tones of the priest, his face grim, his questions probing, his pronouncements carrying the immense weight of divine judgment. See the peasant's bowed head, their hands clasped tightly, their body trembling with fear and the desperate hope of absolution. The fear of unconfessed sin was immense. It was believed that dying with unconfessed mortal sins would condemn one soul to eternal damnation in the fiery pits of hell, a terrifying prospect vividly depicted in sermons and religious art. This profound fear shaped every moral choice, every internal struggle with temptation. The omnipresent awareness of sin and the urgent need for its absolution was a constant, pervasive force in their lives. The priest wielded immense power in this context. Through the sacrament of penance, he had the power to absolve sins, to reconcile the individual with God, to guide them towards salvation. He would assign penances, prayers, fasting, acts of charity, or pilgrimages, designed to atone for transgressions and purify the soul. His role as confessor made him a central figure in the spiritual lives of his parishioners, privy to their deepest fears and their most intimate secrets. The psychological burden of unconfessed sin was heavy. It gnawed at the conscience, fueled anxieties, and intensified the pervasive fear of divine wrath. A blighted crop, an unexpected illness, a sudden death. These could all be interpreted as signs of God's displeasure, a direct consequence of unatoned-for sins. For the children too, the rule of confession was implicitly absorbed. They learned early the gravity of sin, the power of the priest, and the terrifying consequences of eternal damnation, shaping their moral compass from a young age. To sin and not confess is to risk eternal damnation. Peasants lived in fear of the Church's power to absolve or condemn. The rule of confession was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by faith, by the terrifying power of God, and by the absolute authority of the Church to mediate their eternal fate in a world where spiritual consequences were as real as any earthly hardship. The warding of the home. In the profoundly spiritual and often terrifying world of medieval peasants, the home was more than just a mud-daubed hut. It was a fragile sanctuary, constantly vulnerable to both physical dangers and the insidious threats of the unseen. To protect this vital space, religious belief and deep-seated superstition intertwined, giving rise to the rule of the warding of the home. Each home had to have specific religious symbols, protective charms, and consecrated objects to keep evil spirits at bay. A rule strictly enforced by custom, by faith, and by the chilling fear of unholy intrusion. Imagine the air thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed walls, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the subtle tang of dried herbs and beeswax. The sounds were no longer the solemn pronouncements of priests. They included the low murmur of whispered blessings, the soft rustle of cloth as charms were hung, and the profound, expectant silence that accompanied rituals of protection. Lantern light flickering in drafty huts illuminated the tangible symbols of their faith and fear. The belief in evil spirits, malevolent fairies, witches, and the devil himself was deeply ingrained in medieval peasant culture. These forces were believed to be most active at night or during times of sickness and misfortune, seeking to enter homes to cause harm, to steal souls, or to blight the lives of the inhabitants. To leave a home unprotected was to invite profound catastrophe. Listen to the low, muttered words of a mother, tracing the sign of the cross over her children's sleeping forms, whispering a prayer for protection. Hear the anxious pronouncements of the village healer, advising on specific herbs to be hung above the door. See the crude, handmade crosses fashioned from wood or straw, fixed above every window, every doorway, their presence a silent, unwavering prayer. The most common form of warding was the crucifix, either painted crudely on the inner walls, or a small, consecrated wooden cross hung by the hearth or over the bed. This sacred symbol of Christ's sacrifice was believed to be the most potent defense against demonic forces, its power absolute against the forces of evil. Other religious symbols and blessed objects were also vital. Holy water carefully collected from the church might be sprinkled around the threshold or in the corners of the hut, its consecrated power believed to purify and repel malevolence. A palm branch, blessed on Palm Sunday, might be tucked into the thatch or tied to a beam, offering protection against lightning and evil spirits. Fragments of consecrated bread, a relic of communion, might be hidden in small pouches. Superstition also played a strong role. Specific herbs like garlic, rue, or St. John's wort were hung above doors, and windows, their pungent aromas or magical properties, believed to repel witches and mischievous sprites. Iron, a metal with powerful apotropaic qualities, might be placed under the bed or a piece of salvaged iron nailed to the doorframe. These were physical anchors for their spiritual fears. The fear of an unwed home was profound. To neglect these protective rituals was to invite disaster, illness, famine, a child falling sick, animals dying. Such misfortunes were quickly linked to a failure in warding, a direct consequence of leaving the home open to malevolent intrusion. Each home had to have religious symbols to keep evil spirits at bay, a rule strictly enforced by superstition. The warding of the home was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their daily rituals, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by faith, by custom, and by the terrifying power of unseen spiritual forces, transforming their humble dwelling into a constant battleground against the forces of evil. The rule of the pilgrimage. In the profoundly spiritual world of medieval peasants, where sin and salvation were terrifyingly real, and life was often short and brutal, the concept of penance was a powerful motivator. For those who had committed grave sins, for those seeking divine favor in times of plague or famine, or for those simply yearning for a deeper connection to God, the pilgrimage was a supreme act of devotion. The rule of the pilgrimage dictated that these journeys were not just spiritual, they were arduous acts of penance, and they came with strict, often terrifying rules, a profound commitment that reshaped lives and tested the very limits of endurance. Imagine the air, thick with the dust of long roads, the pervasive aroma of unwashed bodies, and the subtle tang of fear and fervent hope. The sounds were no longer the hushed whispers of arguments. They included the rhythmic shuffle of countless feet, the low murmur of prayers, the solemn chanting of hymns, and the distant tolling of bells marking the holy sites. The rustle of woolen cloaks in the wind, a uniform for the devout, accompanied these weary travellers. A pilgrimage was a journey to a sacred site, a local shrine, the tomb of a saint, a distant cathedral, or, for the most ambitious and wealthy, to Rome or even Jerusalem. It was undertaken out of profound piety, or often as a prescribed penance by a priest for serious sins. But it was never a casual undertaking. Listen to the rhythmic shuffle of pilgrims' feet on dusty, uneven paths, their bodies aching, their resolve unwavering. Hear the low murmur of prayers recited endlessly, seeking divine forgiveness, blessings, or miraculous intervention. See the pilgrims, their faces gaunt from travel and fasting, their simple clothes covered in dust, their staffs providing meagre support, their eyes fixed on a distant, holy destination. The rules of the pilgrimage were strict and demanding. Pilgrims were expected to travel light, often on foot, relying on the charity of strangers or the hospitality of monasteries along the way. They often wore specific attire, a simple tunic, a staff, a scallop shell badge, for Compostela, a cross, marking them as pilgrims, identifying them as seekers of God. Penance was a central aspect. Many pilgrimages involved acts of self-denial, fasting, sleeping rough, enduring physical discomfort. Some, like the flagellants, though distinct from general pilgrims, even engaged in self-flagellation, believing that bodily suffering could atone for sins and appease a wrathful God. The more arduous the journey, the greater the perceived spiritual merit. The dangers of pilgrimage were immense. The roads were fraught with perils, bandits, wild animals, treacherous terrain, and the omnipresent threat of disease. Many pilgrims never returned, succumbing to illness, starvation, or violence. To undertake a pilgrimage was to place one's life directly in the hands of God, a profound act of faith and trust. For the peasant, undertaking a pilgrimage was a monumental decision. It meant leaving their land, their family, their duties, often for weeks or months. It risked their meager livelihood, their personal safety, and their future. But the spiritual rewards were believed to be immense. Absolution from sin, a cure for illness, divine favor, and the promise of eternal salvation. The rule of the pilgrimage was more than just a spiritual journey. It was a profound act of self-sacrifice, a desperate attempt to influence one's eternal fate. It was a tangible manifestation of their deep-seated faith, their profound fears, and their unwavering hope in the power of divine intervention. Pilgrimages were not just spiritual, yes, they were acts of penance, and they came with strict rules. The rule of the pilgrimage was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their spiritual lives, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by faith, by custom, and by the terrifying power of God, transforming an arduous journey into a vital, life-altering act of penitence and profound devotion. The social hierarchy and its unwritten codes, the peasant's place. In the rigidly structured world of medieval society, where everyone was bound to a specific station by birth, custom, and divine will, one of the most fundamental and inescapable realities for the peasant was their place. This was not merely a social designation, it was a comprehensive, all-encompassing code that dictated every aspect of their existence. There were rules about where you eat, sleep, and stand, from the humblest village gathering to the grandest manor hall. Knowing your place was not just social etiquette, it was a matter of survival, a profoundly ingrained, unspoken law that ensured stability, but also instilled a constant, pervasive fear of stepping out of line. Imagine the air thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the subtle tang of human presence. The sounds were no longer the solemn chanting of pilgrims. They included the low murmur of respectful conversation, the hushed whispers of warnings, and the subtle shifting of bodies, each in its designated spot. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might blur the landscape, but never the clear, immutable lines of social standing. From the moment you were born, your place was fixed. You were a peasant, a serf, bound to the land and to your lord. This meant a life of ceaseless labor, of poverty, and of profound deference to those above you in the social hierarchy. Your entire existence was defined by your relationship to the land and to your lord, a relationship from which there was virtually no escape. Listen to the hushed tones of a peasant addressing the lord's reeve, their voice lowered, their head bowed, their posture one of absolute submission. Hear the subtle shifts in conversation when a merchant, a craftsman, or, God forbid, a noble entered a gathering. The immediate deferential silence, the careful avoidance of eye contact. See the distinct separation in the village church, the lord and his family in their specially designated pews, the peasants clustered humbly on the cold, hard floor. The rules about where you eat, sleep, and stand were deeply ingrained. In your own hut, the space was communal, but even there, subtle hierarchies existed. The elders by the warmest spot of the hearth, the children nestled together on smaller pallets. But in the presence of anyone of higher status, these rules became absolute. You did not sit in the Lord's presence unless bidden. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not meet his gaze directly. To transgress these unspoken rules of social distance was to commit an act of profound disrespect, an affront to the divine order. It could invite severe punishment, a public whipping for a peasant who spoke out of turn, a fine for perceived insolence, or even a more brutal retribution for a serious challenge to authority. The fear of stepping out of line was pervasive, a constant chilling undercurrent to every interaction. The clothing you wore, the food you ate, the language you used, all were subtle markers of your place. Peasants wore coarse wool and linen in muted colours, ate humble fare, and spoke in their local dialect, reserving formal Latin or more refined language for the church or the Lord's court. Any attempt to mimic the customs or attire of a higher class was a dangerous act of hubris. Knowing your place is not just social, it's a matter of survival. The peasant's place was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their every interaction, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by a rigid social hierarchy enforced by custom, by law, and by the terrifying power of their feudal masters, ensuring absolute submission to the established order, the unspoken laws of marriage. In the medieval peasant's world, where life was a relentless struggle for survival, and every individual's role was meticulously defined, marriage was far more than a matter of personal affection. It was a fundamental social and economic institution, a binding contract that ensured the continuity of the family, the allocation of land, and the stability of the village. The unspoken laws of marriage dictated that peasants were bound by intricate, unwritten rules, from parental approval to community judgment, shaping their intimate lives with a constant, pervasive weight of tradition and profound societal pressure. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the subtle tang of unspoken desires and anxieties. The sounds were no longer the solemn toll of the church bell. They included the hushed whispers of matchmakers, the low murmur of parental negotiations, and the distant, almost ceremonial music of a wedding feast. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might obscure the faces of young lovers, but never the clear, immutable rules of their impending union. Marriage for peasants was primarily a pragmatic affair, a means to create a new labor unit, to work the land, to produce children who would ensure the family's survival and provide for their parents in old age. Love, while it might develop, was rarely the primary consideration. Property, labor, and lineage were paramount. Listen to the hushed tones of parents negotiating a match, discussing the dowry, if any, the land that would be inherited, the labor that a new daughter-in-law would bring to the household. Hear the nervous whispers of young people aware of their parents' intentions, their own feelings often secondary to the needs of the family. See the solemn faces of a young couple standing before the priest exchanging their vows, their individual desires subsumed by the weight of communal expectation. Parental approval was a critical, often absolute, requirement. A marriage could not proceed without the consent of the heads of the families, who would carefully weigh the economic and social implications of the union. To defy parental wishes, to attempt to marry outside these established norms, was an act of profound rebellion, risking social ostracism, disinheritance, and severe censure from the village. The lord's approval was often also required, particularly if the marriage involved a serf from another manor or the transfer of land. Fees might be levied, permission painstakingly sought. The lord's interest lay in maintaining the stability of his workforce, his tax base, and his social order. Community judgment was another powerful force. A marriage that seemed ill-suited or that violated established customs would be met with gossip, disapproval, and subtle social pressure. The reputation of both families and the future prosperity of the new couple depended on a match that met with communal acceptance. The charivari, a noisy, mocking parade, might be organized by villagers to express disapproval of an unsuitable or scandalous union. The unspoken rules extended to the very rituals of courtship. Customs like bundling, where young couples might share a bed under strict conditions, allowed for premarital intimacy within social bounds, but always under the watchful, if distant, eye of the community. These were subtle ways to assess compatibility, but always framed by the overarching rules of propriety. For the young, the weight of these unspoken laws was immense. They learned early that their individual desires were secondary to the needs of the family, the lord, and the community. Their choice of spouse was not entirely their own. It was a deeply societal decision, shaping their entire future. Peasants were bound by unspoken rules of marriage, from parental approval to community judgment. The unspoken laws of marriage were a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their most intimate choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by tradition, by social hierarchy, and by the profound economic and communal demands that determined their future. The rule of social distance. In the rigidly stratified world of medieval Europe, where every individual was born into a specific, immutable social class, the boundaries between lord and peasant were not merely legal, they were profoundly ingrained in every interaction, every space, every gesture. The rule of social distance was absolute. Peasants couldn't simply walk into a lord's house. or address him without elaborate deference. Social boundaries were rigid, and any crossing could bring swift, brutal punishment, a constant, pervasive fear that dictated their movements, shaped their words, and defined their very existence. The rule of social distance. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts, but also infused with the faint, rich aroma of expensive fabrics, burning beeswax candles, and the subtle perfume of a lord's manor. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of neighbours. They included the low murmur of respectful conversation, the hushed whispers of warnings, and the sharp, authoritative bark of a guard. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might blur the landscape, but never the clear, uncrossable lines of social hierarchy. The lord's manor, typically a fortified stone castle or a grand timber hall, stood apart from the peasant village, a symbol of immense power and privilege. It was a world entirely separate from the peasant's humble hut, governed by different rules, populated by different people. To a peasant, the manor was both a source of protection and a profound wellspring of fear. Listen to the hushed tones of a peasant addressing the lord's reeve, their voice lowered, their head bowed, their posture one of absolute submission. Hear the authoritative voice of a guard, his tone sharp, dismissing a peasant who lingered too long at the manor gate. See the distinct separation in the village church, the lord and his family in their specially designated pews, often raised and adorned, the peasants clustered humbly on the cold, hard floor. The rules of social distance were numerous, precise, and rigorously enforced. A peasant did not simply walk into the lord's house or his private chambers. Entry was typically only for specific business, upon summons, and through designated service entrances. One would never approach the lord without permission, never speak unless spoken to, never meet his gaze directly. Every interaction was a careful, choreographed dance of deference and submission. To transgress these unspoken rules was to commit an act of profound disrespect, an affront to the divine and feudal order. It was a direct challenge to the lord's authority and could invite swift, brutal punishment. A peasant who spoke out of turn in the lord's presence, who failed to bow deeply enough, who inadvertently entered a forbidden area, could face fines, public whipping, or even a more severe retribution, potentially leading to mutilation or death. The fear of crossing these boundaries was pervasive, a constant, chilling undercurrent to every interaction. You learned early the precise gestures of submission, the bowed head, the averted gaze, the careful choice of words. Your entire demeanor was one of humility, of profound respect for the immense power of your master. Even the children implicitly absorbed these rules. They learned to avoid the manor grounds, to speak softly when near, to understand that their world, though connected to the lord's, was separated by an uncrossable chasm of social standing. Peasants couldn't simply walk into a lord's house. Social boundaries were rigid, and any crossing could bring swift punishment. The rule of social distance was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their every movement, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by a rigid social hierarchy enforced by custom, by law, and by the terrifying power of their feudal masters, ensuring absolute submission to the established order, the rule of debt. In the precarious world of medieval peasants, where life was a constant struggle against scarcity and the whims of nature, economic stability was a fragile illusion. A single bad harvest, an unexpected illness, or a sudden demand for taxes could plunge a family into desperate need, forcing them to borrow grain or money from wealthier neighbors, the lord, or the church. The rule of debt was a terrifying, inescapable reality. Debt could trap a peasant for life, binding them in chains heavier than iron. There were strict codes on how to handle borrowed money, and often it meant a lifetime of servitude, a profound secret fear that overshadowed every economic decision. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the subtle tang of unspoken anxieties. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of neighbours. They included the low murmur of desperate pleas, the crisp scratch of a quill on parchment as a loan was recorded, and the mournful cries of a family facing ruin. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might obscure the path, but never the clear, grim path of inescapable obligation. Life for the average medieval peasant was lived on the edge of subsistence. A bad season, an animal dying, an unforeseen expense, any of these could force a family to seek a loan. This was a desperate gamble, a pact with the future, often at exorbitant interest rates, from the lord, the church, or a wealthier villager. The grain or coin borrowed would sustain them, but it created an inescapable obligation, a debt that grew larger with each passing season. Listen to the low, anxious murmurs of a peasant trying to negotiate the terms of a loan, their voice filled with a desperate hope. Hear the crisp, authoritative voice of the Lord's reeve, his quill scratching figures onto parchment, recording the details of the debt, the collateral, the repayment date. See the grim faces of families gathered in the Lord's court or the churchyard, witnessing the public declaration of their inability to pay. The rules concerning debt were strict, often merciless, though some kings or local customs might offer temporary relief, such as debt moratoria in times of famine. But the fundamental principle remained: a debt had to be paid. If a peasant could not repay his loan, his meagre possessions, his land, if he held any, and ultimately his family, became collateral. The most chilling consequence was debt servitude. If a parent could not pay their debts, they might be forced to sell themselves, or, more tragically, their children, into temporary or even permanent bondage to work off the obligation. Your sons might be forced to labor in the Lord's fields, your daughters to serve in his household for years, perhaps even a lifetime, their freedom traded for a few measures of grain. This was a chain heavier than any iron, binding not just an individual but entire generations to relentless servitude, a profound intergenerational burden. The psychological toll was immense, the constant fear of accumulating debt, the gnawing anxiety of a bad harvest, the profound despair of seeing your children enter bondage. These were constant, secret fears that overshadowed every aspect of daily life. The freedom of your family, your very future, felt perpetually precarious, always at the mercy of economic misfortune. Debt could trap a peasant for life. There were strict codes on how to handle borrowed money, and often it meant a lifetime of servitude. The rule of debt was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their economic choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by a rigid social hierarchy, by merciless economic realities, and by the terrifying power of debt to turn a family as hope into a lifetime of inescapable servitude. The rule of silence in disputes. In the tightly knit, often claustrophobic world of the medieval peasant village, where grievances festered and disputes were inevitable, the maintenance of social order was paramount. Formal justice was often distant, slow, and biased towards the lord. Thus, local conflicts were frequently mediated by village elders or the lord's reeve under a deeply ingrained, unspoken code, the rule of silence in disputes. If a peasant broke silence during a public dispute, if they spoke out of turn, challenged authority, or displayed overt disrespect, it could be seen as insolence, rebellion, or even a challenge to the entire feudal order, bringing swift, brutal punishment, and profound social ostracism. The rule of silence in disputes. Imagine the air thick with the earthy scent of mud-daubed huts, the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, and the palpable tension of unspoken resentments. The sounds were no longer the cheerful chatter of neighbors. They included the low murmur of nervous whispers, the hushed tones of arguments being presented, and the grave, measured tones of an elder delivering judgment. Morning fog over freshly ploughed fields might obscure the faces of the disputants, but never the clear, immutable rules of conduct. A dispute could arise from countless sources: a stray animal trampling crops, a boundary marker subtly shifted, a broken promise of shared labor, a debt unpaid, or a festering personal grudge. These conflicts, if left unchecked, could escalate, threatening the fragile social cohesion of the village and potentially leading to violence or open defiance of authority. Listen to the hushed tones of a peasant presenting their grievance before the village elder or the Lord S. Reeve, their voice carefully modulated, their posture deferential. Hear the low murmur of other villagers gathered to witness the proceedings, their faces grimly focused, silently judging, their presence reinforcing the weight of communal expectation. See the disputants, often standing rigidly, their eyes fixed on the ground, their bodies tense with suppressed anger or fear. The rule of silence during such a hearing was absolute. Peasants were expected to present their case when asked, to listen respectfully to the other side, and, crucially, to remain silent when the elder or reeve deliberated, and especially when judgment was delivered. To interrupt, to argue, to raise one's voice, to express open defiance. These were profound transgressions. Breaking silence could be seen as an act of insolence, a challenge to the authority of the arbiter, or even a subtle form of rebellion against the established social order. In a feudal system built on obedience and deference, any perceived challenge, however small, could not be tolerated. The consequences were swift and brutal. The penalty for breaking silence could range from a public reprimand, a fine imposed by the Lord's court, or even a more severe punishment like the whip. Most terrifyingly, it could lead to social ostracism, to being marked as a troublemaker, as someone who defied custom, eroding the vital communal support that was essential for survival. The fear of this retribution was pervasive. Even when their arguments felt just, even when anger boiled, peasants learned to suppress their immediate reactions, to hold their tongues, to submit to the process, however flawed. Their very survival depended on maintaining the appearance of obedience, of deference to authority. If a peasant broke silence during a public dispute, it could be seen as disrespect or even rebellion. The rule of silence in disputes was a weird, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their interactions, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by a rigid social hierarchy enforced by custom, by law, and by the terrifying power of their feudal masters, ensuring absolute submission to the established order, even in moments of profound injustice.